Welcome to Liner Notes, a podcast about how scholars plan and stay organized and the tools they use. In each episode, I interview a scholar about what's in their pen case, or something akin to a pen case if they don't have one, how they plan their time, and their secrets to an organized academic life. But this is a special episode in which I'm going to talk with historian Zachary Schrag, who has recently published the Princeton Guide to Historical Research. He has a lot of observations drawn from his research for that book about how historians historically have organized their notes and conducted their research and put those things together to form historical books. And so he has watched all of these episodes and drawn some observations that he's going to share with us today. So Zachary Schrag is a professor of history at George Mason University. He's the author of The Great Society Subway, A History of the Washington Metro, Ethical Imperialism, Institutional Review Boards in the Social Sciences, 1965 to 2009, and the recently released Princeton Guide to Historical Research, and the forthcoming this June, The Fires of Philadelphia, Citizen Soldiers, Nativists, and the 1844 Riots Over the Soul of a Nation. I'm Catherine Rye-Jewell, a professor and historian at Fitchburg State University in Massachusetts. All right, so welcome to this special episode. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And I'll just hold up the book. I don't know if it'll be mirrored, that this arrived at my house last night on my doorstep, and perfect timing to feature it instead of, a little cutout. I have the actual physical book. So congratulations on that, on its release.
Thank you.
And the forthcoming book as well. We had conceived of this episode right at the very beginning when I was first just talking about, having this podcast, and, I wasn't even really sure what it was going to be yet. And so we had this conversation about, that at the end of it, we would look back at what all of these different scholars had talked about and try and draw some larger conclusions about sort of the state of historians and their tools and their practices and methods. And to use this as a source of evidence, and so you had some observations after watching these and given your insights from this book that you just wrote on historical research. So I'm curious, what sort of your first takeaway?
Yeah, so a lot of what I've been doing with the book has been reading what historians say about their work styles and talking to historians about that. And so, it's just been great fun watching your interviews and seeing how these different people respond to the same set of questions. I think the first overwhelming takeaway from your series is the importance of outlining, because it does so much work in the world. Obviously, there's kind of classic outlining where you say, I know what topics I want to cover, and so I'm going to put them in some kind of order and then fill them in. And that's essential to any kind of writing, really, from the 5-paragraph essay to the full book, is just knowing where you want to put things. Are you going to put things in chronological order? Are you going to put them in thematic order? Are you going to put a sort of series of pro arguments and then a series of con arguments? That's absolutely crucial. But I think one of the things that's coming out of your interviews is that's just one of many things that outlines can do. So a couple of your guests talked about that fear of the blank page. And I certainly experienced that. The hardest thing I ever wrote was my college senior thesis, where I spent months kind of taking notes and not writing anything. And then, the first day I had to write something, I got a paragraph out and was so proud of myself. And that was completely unnecessary in retrospect, because you can outline as soon as you start researching. You can outline before you start researching. I could assign you a biography of someone and not tell you who it is. And you could say, well, the person was probably born, and they probably had a childhood and education, and they're like a family life and maybe some professional or civic accomplishments. And, you have the Wikipedia template, and you can write that on the blank page before I even tell you who you're writing about. So there's, just break the blankness with an outline. If, I were saying, you need to write the story of some invention. Well, okay, what were the problems people were trying to solve? What were the predecessor technologies? Who claimed to be the first with the invention? What was the spread of it, the diffusion? Again, you can outline a lot before I tell you what the topic is. And that will grow and change, but you won't have a blank page anymore. the second thing that you talked about with your guests was reverse outlining someone else's work. And, I think this is very common that historians borrow each other's organizational systems just relentlessly. I mean, it's the one thing you can copy without any fear or shame. Because, again, these, some of these things are just standard going back to Thucydides or Gibbon or something, the decline and fall narrative, right? You don't have to cite Gibbon to do that. You just take. And if you want to do a decline and fall narrative, you start with some kind of plateau. Rome in the Age of the Antonines is Gibbon's, and then Tom Segru did that with his Arsenal chapter, and then, Detroit kind of goes down from there. So just thinking about the works that you love, whether they're books or essays or movies, whatever, and figuring out what makes them work and reverse outlining them is extremely helpful. Reverse outlining your own work. And this is something that I think you've talked about with your guests, and I certainly encourage my students to do, and do a lot with my own, is if you are someone especially who just likes to get some words on the page, that's fine. You don't have to outline and then write. You can write and then outline, but it's still an essential part of then figuring out, okay, how do I put these arguments together or these scenes together? Scheduling time has been a big theme of your series, and outlines are great for that, right? If you have a sense that you've got this many sections of paper or this many chapters in the book, you can roughly budget your time and know in advance a little bit, it's always uncertain, but a little bit how much time it will take. And then, a crucial thing, and I'm not sure this came up with in your interviews, but this is something I've learned, is it's a lot easier to get people's feedback on an outline or a summary than on a full thing. Like, however many friends you have, however long your work, more of your friends will be willing to read the 5% version of your thing than the 100% version. And I really hit this with the Philadelphia book, where I was sent a book proposal, so, a fairly short thing, 15 pages maybe, to a friend of mine. And this is someone who is busy. He was not going to read, a multi-hundred-page manuscript. But he looked at the proposal and he said, I think these parts are boring. And, if he thought the paragraph summary of the chapter was boring, who knows what he would have thought of the whole chapter. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna cut that chapter, right? And it was really some of the best feedback that I got was at that proposal stage. So I think the same thing is with an outline. Do these arguments parse? If I just give you the topic sentences, does that flow? And someone can look at that. Again, it can be a 2-page outline, and they can look at that and say, no, part 2C and part 4F are the same argument. Like, why are they in different sections of this paper? And they can do that very quickly in a way that having them read the whole paper, they're getting distracted by, all kinds of atrocities you've done to the Chicago Manual style and all the rest. So, I think outlines are just indispensable in so many ways. And the one thing I was going to say, Eladio Bobadilla's point about the double outline, that he had like a narrative outline and an argument outline, like I thought that was brilliant. I'd love to see some of those physically.
Yeah, what struck me is as I was talking to people, it made me think about how outlines take many different forms. I think we tend to think about like, oh, I don't use outlines because I don't use, the word function with like Roman numerals and like, ABC underneath. Yeah. But, an outline can be a stack of documents with sticky notes put into them to identify the pieces that you're going to be using. And it strikes me that in and of itself is a framework, it's a logical construction of information, just like the project synopsis or, chapter, annotated chapter outline, that it's a way to kind of visualize the logical frameworks and structures that we use to tell stories. And because I think there is a tension in what we do as historians between the argumentative framework and the logical frameworks that we apply to information and the need to tell these stories.
Well, it's interesting because this is where I'll put in my plug for Scrivener, which I absolutely love. I'm not sure I could have finished either of these books without it. But Scrivener was created by a novelist, and I believe it's used by a lot of screenwriters as well. And it actually has these functions where you are basically doing scenes, and each scene has a synopsis. So, Darth Vader reveals that he's Luke's father. That would be a card on there. Sorry for the spoiler. And then you would slide that around, like, where do I want that to happen? And but it also is incredibly powerful for the more argumentative structure. So, the great thing about Scrivener is you write and you outline at the same time. It's the best way I can describe it. Instead of going back and forth between two documents, you've got a column called the binder that shows the whole thing, and then you can work on any one part of it, and it makes it very easy to slide things around in a way that Word really does not. And so I think that it's a mistake to draw too big a division between storytelling and argument. That's historians are supposed to be good at both, and I think that there are a lot of techniques that overlap, and outlining is one of them. That people who want to tell a story can be very involved in outlining, again, even if they use slightly different terminology, such as storyboarding.
Yeah, I think it does also relate to the question of the blank page, though, in that, sometimes, when we're jumping into a project, we might not necessarily know what we're arguing yet. And so it's like, just write the story, just write from the documents. And that kind of gets you flowing, and you build to the argument. So then you take that snippet and you say, okay, well, what am I really saying here? And then you kind of work that structure on top of it. We don't always necessarily work that way. But that's definitely how I used Scrivener with the college radio book. And some of that had to do with the nature of the project. And, we could talk about, your next point as well about how tools change over time. Because when I approached this project, it was many, many archival collections. I think I have, probably 80 different archival collections that go into this book, and, different sites. And so it's very difficult to construct a master narrative or story, but I could tell each individual one. And then in Scrivener, I could see, like, well, these two kind of go together. It's got the same themes that it's dealing with. It's, similar chronologically, the two different views of a similar development at this particular moment. And so I could put those in conversation with one another. And I think that's one of the real powerful things of the outline and just, the way that we are constructing the story and the argument together is it puts information, it puts our raw materials of our sources into conversation with one another.
Yeah, so I had this wonderful experience last academic year of team teaching a course with Scott Berg in our English department, and he's a writer of narrative nonfiction. I mean, he's a historian, but trained, in English and journalism. And his metaphor is you put the clay on the table, right? You just put all that stuff on the table, and then you slide it around into the form that you want. And again, Scrivener is fantastic for that because it, almost tactilely, you slide things up and down and see where they fit. And, for me with the Philadelphia book, it wasn't so much the archival range that you had as the time span was so compressed. Like, I have multiple chapters on a single day because so much was going on July 7th, 1844. And so if I have a document that I'm reading through and it's someone's account of that day, I have to slide that into multiple different chapters. And I couldn't have done that if they were all separate documents. I needed to be able to see things. And, maybe someone says, oh yeah, and back in May, this is what happened. I'm like, oh gosh, I got to get to the May chapter. So, Scrivener is that big table that will take all the clay you want to pile on it, and then you can move it around.
Yeah. So, so I noticed you observed that our tools change over time, but they also change over the course of a project. So, for example, I started out using Scrivener, but now Scrivener isn't as useful, because I'm still moving pieces around, but I kind of have a lot of it established. And now I've moved back into Word, but sorry, I have a siren going by. There it goes. It's very exciting here. So I'm wondering if you noticed anything regarding how these tools change from the interviews.
So, I think Austin McCoy mentioned this, and can't remember the exact details of his project. I think a big one, for me has been the difference between archival and published sources, and then trying to get those together. And this is, where I get in some trouble with my colleagues who are pushing for tropy, which is, good for archival sources, but not good for published sources, and then Zotero, and they don't talk to each other. But, you do have some, things change. The tools themselves will change, right? You get a software update where it can be really good, where suddenly, this terrible flaw in the product is resolved. I mean, certainly, I don't know if it's a hardware or software thing, but it used to be if you tried to open a really big document in Microsoft Word, it would crash, and it doesn't do that anymore. And I don't know if that's the memory in my laptop or the software update. So sometimes things get a lot better. I recorded a series of interviews, not interviews, of videos about using Scrivener, and I had this whole disclaimer about how the Windows Scrivener didn't have all the same features, and then just before I was going to release it, they released Scrivener 3 for Windows. I had to go back and edit the audio. And then other things get crappier. I mean, usually they get more expensive. This happened to people who were using Evernote. Suddenly they relied on this thing for years, and suddenly they're being charged a subscription price. And I've had that happen with software, or it doesn't get updated for your new chip or whatever. So, some of this is forced on you. And then, I think just your job responsibilities may change, your family responsibilities may change. So it's good not to get too much into a rut on whatever tools you use. And I think that came out some in your interviews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's definitely those sort of desired features that we always want. And I always seem to end up using multiple tools to kind of get to the sort of X factor that I need. No one tool kind of can do it all. Right.
I think the challenge is to not try to do it all in one, but not try to do it all in 6 or 7 either. The workflows that I wonder about are the people who, seem to be copying and pasting for every note, into multiple places. And I think a good system is one where a lot of that is automated, where once you've taken the note, it's also attached to the citation and, maybe the location. So you're not, back when physical libraries were a little more important, I would have, every time I identified a book I wanted to read, I would list it in which library I needed to go to. And because it was a relational database, I could have multiple libraries. So if I'm going to the Library of Congress, I'd have one shopping list. And if I was going to the public library, I'd have a different shopping list. And, again, a lot of that was just built into the database, not me cutting and pasting into a separate Excel sheet for the Library of Congress. And then, did I update that? So, try to get it down to 2 or 3, I think, is the sweet spot.
I also noticed there was an interesting juxtaposition regarding the use of notes on books. So we had Hillary Green's system of taking notes, and that she would even use them as a reminder for when she lent a book to a student, and that the notes kind of live in the front of the book, and that they kind of record her history with that book. Yeah. And then you have Ellie Schirmer's approach where she uses Zotero, where she even captures kind of the contextual surroundings for when she's reading the book. In a sense, they're doing the same thing. They're kind of recording their relationship with that material over time. But they're using very different tools to do that. And so, what we're doing with the information is it seems very different because they're very different styles and different tools that we're doing, but the end goal or the underlying conversation that we're having with material is the same.
Right. And this was, something that I was thinking about with the Princeton guide especially, is before you say, I'm going to use this tool or that tool, can you think about what functionalities you want and then look for the tool that will provide that? So certainly if you are trying to have a summary of the book that you're using, and to me that's less a research than a teaching function, because I'm going to go into the seminar and teach the book, as opposed to extract a little nugget of information out of it from my own research. Is that going to live in a separate sheet in the book? Is it going to live on the fly pages? Or are you going to write it on the fly pages and then dictate it into Zotero or something? But you kind of know that, yeah, you want to have your own précis of a book somewhere. And, likewise, obviously with any kind of research, you're going to have full bibliographic information about any kind of source that you use, because that's the rule. You need to have that for the citation. But again, that can live in a database, that could, potentially live in a separate bibliography. It can live in different places. You just need to know that you have that function. So, I think it's helpful. This is how you're supposed to shop for houses, I think, is, before you tour houses, you write down, here's the stuff that I'm looking for in a house. Yeah. So that when you go into a house,
needs and wants list.
Right. So no house is going to be perfect, but you don't, if you've got that list ahead of you, and you go into the house and it's got a beautiful garden, you can say, oh yeah, I don't care about gardens, right? Or if you go into the house and it's got a beautiful kitchen, it's oh yeah, I do care about kitchens. You want to imagine your priorities before you select the thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I've erred a lot of times where I jump into a tool, start using it, and realize it doesn't have this necessary thing that I need, and then whoops, I got to take all that and somehow migrate it, usually messily, to the tool that might actually do the things that I need it to do.
Yeah, and this is kind of my third point, is sort of how crummy a lot of our tools are, because I think we're in this generational shift where I'm old enough to have started college with a typewriter, and certainly haven't seen a typewriter in a while. But it is impressive when you talk to people about their pens and their paper, not just how many choices they have, but how able they are to customize their tools, right? If you have a particular pen you like, you can then match it with a different ink if it's a fountain pen, and you can have a different paper and then buy a binder cover from someone else, and you can put a sticker on it. There's a lot of customization you can do, whereas a lot of our software tools are not that customizable. Microsoft Word has, I think, gotten downhill on this. You used to have these floating palettes where I could put all my favorite tools, and that just went away in some update, and I think that same update killed every macro I'd ever written, because they switched the code on me. So now I've gone back to customizing a few ribbons, writing a few macros. But, for the most part, you're stuck with a lot of the features. And, with open source software like Zotero, if you have pretty advanced coding skills, you can write a fork of it, but most of us don't have that. This is sort of my plug here for FileMaker Pro, which has a lot of scripting tools built in that for me are the sweet spot between really not learning code, but being able to program a lot of stuff and customize it on the fly. So if I've got one button where if I'm reading through a series of daily newspapers, I can just say same newspaper next day. And then I'm working on that and oh, here's a weekly that I'm working on. Okay, so I'm going to duplicate that script and change the 1 to a 7. And now when I hit the button, it's same newspaper next week. And if I hit a biweekly newspaper, guess what? Change it to a 14. So, there are lots of scripts that I can do in FileMaker with, a very small amount of understanding of, logic. Where, again, most of our software doesn't do that. And so I think, I just, from the interviews, I heard a lot more love for people's pens and paper than for their software. And I think that's the reason that.
Yeah. I think there's something I've been talking, my mother's also a writer, and she, and we both love pens. We have a deep, abiding love for our analog tools. And she had read somewhere that one of the things that we tend to need is for our systems to be satisfying. And I think that's sort of one of the reasons that we see this kind of revolt to analog. I think of Laura Burnett has gone back and bought an IBM Selectric typewriter because there's something satisfying about that tactile experience. And I think, some of that customization that we could do with some of the older versions of Word, for example, they gave us some of that, or say, like I always remembered when I was TAing, somebody a professor I was working for said, always watch for those papers where the student's clearly been playing with the font, because it means that they're more worried about the font than what they're saying. Whereas like I kind of understood the students playing with the font because it was part of their process and like sort of figuring out the thing that looked like them and, their voice on the page. Yeah. That I think we can be, we can incorporate that and sort of appreciate that as part of these tools, whether they're analog or digital. But with the digital, it can be more challenging to kind of extract that satisfying experience from it.
Yeah, and a colleague of mine, Mike O'Malley, he had the same sort of experience, I think, with blogging, where a lot of WordPress sites tend to look alike, and that he wanted his blog to look like him, and he's a very colorful person. So, I understood that. So, yeah, a lot of, I think, what we do is, and this goes back to writing as well, is you've got conventions, right? Any book more or less has chapters. Either it has a preface and an epilogue, or an introduction and conclusion. It's got some kind of sandwich structure. But we want to be able to stretch within that. And, I do hope that in the future, more software is a little more flexible to our needs.
Yeah. And I actually noticed this morning that Microsoft is looking for its next default font for Word. And even though, you kind of first glance at them, they're all sans serif fonts, like they all, have a sort of modern look. But, once you start really looking at them, like it does matter. And I can't stand Calibri, and maybe that's just because it's ubiquitous. And, it's sort of the blinking cursor on that blank page. And I've just learned to have bad associations with Calibri for that reason. But, it is a big decision. These design elements are really important, even down to a physical book. So this is, I noticed that you talked about, when we first were discussing this, that you had experience in looking at previous generations of historians' papers and got a sense of what their methods were. And, how far have we come? What can we learn from them?
Yeah, so a lot of what I argue in the Princeton book is about continuity over change. I mean, this is always this balancing act that historians do, but, I tend to be on the continuity side, both in terms of methods and arguments. So again, with the Gibbon example, he's writing in the 1770s, but a lot of his basic structure is something that you could do the decline and fall of college radio, right? I mean, that would be something Gibbon could understand, kind of. He might not know what radio was, but you could explain it to him. Oh yeah, something was good and then it went to crap. That part he would definitely get. And similarly in terms of analyzing primary sources, that's something that he does. And I don't know his note-taking system. The oldest notes I've looked at myself were the David Maple Madison papers, which are from the early 20th century at the Library of Congress. He was working on a book on riots that he never finished. And having worked on riot history myself, I kind of know why he never finished it. It turns out to be this very soft and squishy topic that's not easily defined. But he was going through Niles' Weekly Register and writing down all the references to riots in this kind of ledger that he had. And guess what? That's pretty similar to what a lot of 21st century historians do. And then, I looked at my papers, my late colleague, Roy Rosenzweig. His dissertation was about Worcester becomes 8 hours is what we will, for what we will. And, he had a mix of note cards and note pages there. And you could see him, again, sort of writing down the metadata, here's the summary, and then here's what I think. And the same basic thought process that we're doing decades later. And for the Park and the People, Roy was switching to computers already. So there are some computer printouts in his papers. So, I tend to think that the switch to computers is not as revolutionary as some would claim. I think there are, amazing changes. The two being this kind of mass digitization in terms of Google Books and the newspaper archives and those kinds of tools where other people have digitized, millions of pages of text, and then the very small scale digitalization, which is one of us going into an archive with a digital camera and doing that kind of raid rather than the residential fellowship of years past. So I don't want to say the technology doesn't matter, but I think the basic project is not as different as some might claim. And I think the needs of note-taking are not so different either. You need to basically be able to take a lot of notes on one source and then sort them into a different arrangement to integrate them with other sources. And, unfortunately, again, I think a word processor is a very poor tool to do that. It's not really made for sorting. A spreadsheet is not a good tool for do that because it's not made for words. It's made for numbers. Very good for sorting numbers, but not so good for sorting words. And, so I think that I would just encourage people to remain dissatisfied with the tools that we have and keep looking for better ones.
That's great. And I think one of the theses that emerge from the podcast is that, everybody kind of needs the space to figure out their own way, whether it's time of day that they're writing or, approach to a certain project, that these are very, very personalized. But at the same time, we're all kind of operating within these frameworks and these larger conversations. I think that came through in Austin McCoy's, that the idea of writing, that we have this very narrow definition of what that is, but in actuality, it encompasses all of these many different types of activities.
So,
from outlining and
where I would push back some, I'm just looking on my shelf to see if I can find it. Hold on a second. This is The Modern Researcher by Barzun and Graf, and this is my 1957 copy. And the thing is, back in 1957, basically there was one technique, which was the note card / notebook technique for taking notes. And, not sure I can find it here, but it would go in about, 3 or 4 pages of a book like this. If you've read Umberto Eco's How to Write a Thesis, he's got a lot of note cards in there. Like, we had this down in the 1950s through the 1970s. And then the computer came in, and there was, I think, this path not taken where Apple had this thing called HyperCard. I never used it myself, but I know there was a lot of hype about it, that I think was going to be kind of index cards.
I remember that. I was introduced to that in my computing class in the 5th or 6th grade.
Right, and really, I think it was going to maybe democratize some of this, and it never really, it died for mysterious reasons. A lot of great things do, and I don't think we really have anything quite right. So I wish I could go into a class with undergraduates or graduate students and in 20 minutes explain how to take notes. And I can't. I could teach them the index card thing, but they're not going to do that because they want to be able to cut and paste, as do I.
Search
or search, right? And if you've got all of your secondary sources on JSTOR, Project Muse, or something, do you really want to print them out and cut them up or copy them out by hand? I think that yes, there is a need for personalization, but there's also opportunities for a kind of standard thing that could then be personalized.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think maybe another way to put it is I think we've lost a common vocabulary for what it is we're doing. That where, we had, the index card was the index card. It was a process, but it also, it I don't know if this is the right way of putting it, but it's kind of symbolized a certain tool within the process. that we all sort of understood what an index card could do in its many different functions. But I don't think that we have the same kind of common standardized vocabulary around what it is that we're doing, and that we have all these many different possibilities, even though we're fundamentally still kind of doing the same thing. It's articulated in these many different ways and through these many different tools.
Right, and the anthropologists, maybe others, talk about a signature methodology. Do you do interviews? Do you do quantitative stuff? Historians do primary source research. Obviously we do some synthetic things as well, but the guts of what we do is looking at primary sources, often archival, not always. And it is weird that we don't have a standard model on the nuts and bolts of that. And people are, I think, working toward that. And again, I'd love to, think that 20 years from now we'll be back to something as good as the index card, maybe even better.
Onward the index card. Well, thank you so much for doing this, for watching all of the episodes and helping us think historically about them in multiple ways.
Well, it's a pleasure, and I look forward to your continued work on this.